Now that you know a little bit about SASS, and before we get too into some of the more advanced topics of what SASS can do, I want to talk to you about organizing your SASS files. This is really important because, as you probably already know, you can easily end up with a CSS file that is very lengthy, and it gets to be confusing to just figure out where to put all the different elements that you're needing to style throughout your website. SASS is a great tool to use because it allows you to easily break up your CSS into logical little chunks, and that's what we're going to be covering this week. As you already know, SASS allows you to write CSS more efficiently. This week, we're going to be covering how we can keep our CSS code dry. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. One way to write drier code is to separate concerns and keep related code in separate files. This allows you to maintain code in one reasonable file. Anything you can do in CSS, you can do in SASS. You already know that. This includes using the @import directive. But as you've probably come to expect, SASS is going to extend the @import in some useful ways. To start with, it supports the inclusion of SASS and SASSy CSS files. The basic syntax is the same. You just use the @import and then you're going to put the file name. SASS is going to extend the CSS @import rule so that it works with SASS and SASSy CSS. It imports the file referenced and any variables or mixins that are defined into the imported file, and then they can be used in the main file. The advantage of using SASS to do this is you avoid any additional HTTP requests. You may already be familiar with the @import directive. It's a CSS @based rule that was briefly popular before falling out of favor due to performance issues. If you've been developing websites for a while, you may remember using it, and sometimes you'll even use it now. By using the CSS @import directive, you could include style sheets inside other style sheets. The included files could either be located on the same server or included with a URL to a directory or another server. While this allowed developers to import CSS files into other CSS files, the practice fell out of favor, mainly because of a performance hit in @import. SASS removes the performance hit because the @import statements are removed from your SASS code. It happens when it actually compiles to the CSS. In this way, it's much more efficient. Let me show you how this looks inside of a SASS file. So let me just show you how SASS deals with the @import directive. Here's the page that I'm going to be working on for this week's lesson. It's just a simple page, but it has some styling that's occurring with CSS. My HTML is pretty basic. I have a link out to my CSS file, and inside the body I have a header with an H1, I have an article with an H1 and an H2, several paragraphs, and then a footer. Because my page is not too complex, my CSS is not that complex either, but you can see that I still have over 100 lines of code. Inside of this file, I'm actually using the @import directive, and I'm importing in my link to the Google font that I'm using for this project. So this file is actually being called in from the CSS file. If we look at our CSS file, you can see that here's the @import directive up at the top, and it's linking out to the web to get the Google fonts. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to pull out some of the code from the CSS and put it in a separate SASS file so that I can show you how SASS deals with the @import directive. I have some styles right here near the top of my page that just serve as reset styles. They pretty much are just zeroing out margin and padding and some other basic reset settings, something that I would want to have happen to every single element before I started going into the more specific styling that I wanted to occur on the page. So I'm going to select this code and I'm going to cut it. Then I'm going to make a new file and I'll paste this code in and we'll save this file. I'm going to save this file into my SASS folder, and I'm going to call this file reset.sass. I'm going to go back into my main SASS file. I'm calling this project1.sass. And up here, after I import in the Google fonts, I'm going to use the @import directive, and then I'm just going to say the name of the file that I want to import. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to import in our SASS file. I'll just use @import and then put reset.sass. I'm going to save my file, And if we look at our page in the browser, you can see that nothing has actually changed. The page looks exactly the same. That's what we would expect it to look like. But let me show you what happens in our CSS file. If I go into my project1.css file, you can see that here I have the @import statement, and then I have the reset code. So this is the code that we put in the reset. Let me make a change to something that happens in the reset, just so you can see that this is actually occurring and updating. I'm going to go back to my reset.sass file, and we're just going to make another rule here. And this rule is going to be for article, and we'll make the article have background color of black. Now that I've done that, I've saved the file. Now, because I didn't make a change to my project.1 SASS file, my SASS file has not actually compiled. I'm going to go into my Koala and I'm going to force the file to compile. So I'll go ahead and click refresh, and you can see that it's recognized 2 new CSS files. Now if I go back and I look into my CSS folder, you can see that I have 2 new files. I have my reset.css and the reset.css map file. If we look at our project1.css file, you can now see that here's the new rule that we just made, article background color of black. So now this rule that we declared in the reset.css file is now being rendered out in our project1. It does write a reset.css file, and it actually has to do that, but then that file is now getting pulled into the project1.css. So in this way, we're not making any additional HTTP requests, which is great for load time and functionality. I'm going to go back into my reset file and we'll delete this article with the background color of black. I'm going to save my reset file. And now if we take a look in our reset.css file, that rule is no longer there. I do want to bring your attention to, if I go into my project1.css file, the rule remains. And that's because as far as SASS is concerned, I only made a change to my reset.sass file. I never changed anything in project1.sass, so it felt that there was no need for it to refresh. I would need to do something to this file. I could just hit a space and hit a delete and save the file. And now if we go back to project1.css, you'll see that that line of code, and it was right in between these rules right here, it no longer exists. So when you're using @imports, it does work, but know that the file that is doing the importing, the main file, if you don't make a change to that, it's not necessarily going to update that rendered out CSS file. So that is a caveat, but obviously it's easy enough to fix that. You could also force it to compile by writing in your terminal or shell editor, or you could go into Koala and click on the project1.sass and click compile, and this would again force it to compile. So those are 2 ways that you can work around it. So using the @import directive is going to force the call to happen at runtime, and this is going to avoid those performance problems with the standard CSS @import. Normally, whenever you use the @import directive, it's located at the top of the file where the contents will have global scope. There's some exceptions where you could nest @import statements, and sometimes we may want to nest them inside of a mixin, which we haven't discussed yet, so that'll come in a future lesson. Or we might want to put them inside of some sort of control statement. So it is feasible to use an @import statement elsewhere in your code, but normally we'll want the elements from the @import to have global scope, so we'll define them right up at the top.